This is the third session in the introductory small ruminant webinar series. My name is Megan Purdue. I am the ag agent in Worcester County. I'm going to be filling in for Susan Shanian, our University of Maryland Extension sheep and goat specialist, as the host. This evening she's here, but she's gonna be in the chat box answering questions. Some little housekeeping things. Put your questions in the chat box. This is going to be a large webinar with a lot of attendees, so please keep your mics muted, and sometimes taking your video off helps other people who don't have quite as good of internet as you do. And then also these sessions will be recorded. They will eventually end up on the YouTube channel once they're edited, and Susan's going to put that web address in the chat box so that you can look that up and subscribe to that. Then you'll know anytime we add a new session. Tonight we're going to talk about raising sheep and goats, and your presenter tonight is Charlie Sasscer. He is the Ag Marketing Extension Educator in Prince George's County. So it looks like you're good to go. Take it away. I'm going to mute myself.
All right, that sounds good. Thank you, Megan, for the introduction. She said, my name is Charlie Sasscer. I'm the Ag Marketing Extension Educator for Prince George's County. I'm also a livestock producer in St. Mary's County. So we're going to jump in tonight on raising them. This presentation will have a bit of a sheep focus, but I'm sure as those of you all who have attended the last 2 weeks, you'll know that there's a lot of similarities as well as differences in the production systems between sheep and goats. So just wanted to start off with a map here. I have the sheep populations for the top 10 most populated sheep states in the United States. And I just wanted to contrast those to what we have here in Maryland, 24,000 versus say 735,000. Just kind of to preface that, our environment, our climate, our marketing opportunities are going to look very different here on the East Coast versus if you go west or north. So I'm kind of, the pictures that we'll have, the system that will kind of describe, it might fit our area here, but if you go somewhere else, or even if you go right down the road to your neighbor's operation, may be very different. So here we have what I've kind of outlined as the sheep year. I'm not sure if you all can see my mouse, but we're going to start here at the breeding season. So for our hypothetical situation, we're going to start this in the middle of October or about November, about where we are right now. We'll kind of go through our breeding season, what happens there, gestation, which would be for about 152 days with sheep. We'll go through lambing, or for goats would be kidding. Talk about the time when the lambs and the ewes are together. Then we'll talk about some things with weaning, and then what the lambs do after that, as well as what the ewes do after the period of weaning. So as I said, we're kind of, for our situation here, we're going to start with our breeding season of turning our rams out right now in the middle of October. And this could be different. Like I said, this would be for a system where we're lambing in the say the beginning of March. A lot of operations may lamb before that, therefore their rams would go out before that. You might be lambing on pasture later, so May. So again, your breeding season will be different. Like I said, every operation is going to be a little bit different. We're kind of just going to just talk about one type of operation here, and then we can get into discussing really how you can modify this example situation to fit your labor, fit your pasture, whatever unique situation you're in. So sheep are what we like to call short day breeders. So their fertility is very influenced by the amount of daylight that they receive, or more specifically the decrease in daylight. So their fertility is going to be very high in the fall, hence why it works to have our breeding season in the fall. So their estrus cycle lasts an average of 17 days. And again, using our fall breeding season here, and that high fertility, a lot of ewes will conceive either in their first cycle or the second cycle. For our little scenario here, we're going to say that we'll rotate rams out after the second and third cycle to cover any open ewes. So if you add that up, that's really three estrus cycles is about 51 days. So a pretty tight lambing window if we're successful in getting all of our ewes bred at that time. So at the time that our breeding season is taking place, we would be doing fall grazing right now. If you have some stockpiled growth, if you're on a fescue pasture, or if you've got some winter annuals planted that are, got them planted early, whatever it may be, you're probably out on pasture right now. For our situation, we'd hope we could stretch those, last until about Christmas time. And then we might, if it's a drought year, it might be a little bit shorter. If we're really good about our stockpiling and our grazing, we might last longer into the winter before we have to bring them into winter housing to start feeding hay. The point of winter housing is, partially to protect them from the elements. But if we have a mild winter, it may really be the focus may really be more to allow us to feed hay, have the infrastructure to put out hay. Or any kind of whatever our diet may be that we're going to get them through the winter. So in late February, so again with our if we breed in middle of October to November, in late February we may start adding grain to the diet. This increase in energy supports fetus and mammary development. And then 4 weeks prior to our lambing, as we'll talk about in a minute, that will be about the middle of March. 4 weeks prior, we could give our ewes Clostridium perfringens type C and D, or overeating diseases, and a tetanus vaccine.
You'll have to turn that up.
And that's so that those ewes develop those antibodies that are then passed onto the lambs through the colostrum. So if we have hair sheep, this isn't something that we would do. But if we are raising a wool breed, we may consider pre-lambing shearing or crutching. Crutching would be when you shave the not necessarily the underlines, but the udder area as well as the vulva. And we have several reasons for doing this. It creates a drier and a cleaner environment for the lambs. If you think about what the lambs are, the environments, they have their surrounding environment, but where they stay so close to the ewe, that also is kind of a microenvironment that they're exposed to. So keeping, taking some of that wool away, either the entire fleece or just some of it, it really creates a drier environment for those lambs to be born into. And again, it's cleaner. If those ewes have a lot of manure or mud or foreign materials matted in, again, if you can remove all of that, it's just a cleaner environment. Studies have shown that shearing lambs or crutching can increase lamb birth weight. The mechanism behind that is not completely understood, but studies have repeatedly shown that. And then again, if you're raising a sheep for their fleece, it can improve fleece quality. Again, just by helping them stay cleaner, not as much wool for birthing materials, manure, different things to get trapped in. By shearing your sheep, you have better access to feeders. If you think about how wide a shorn ewe is versus a not shorn ewe, you're able to fit more ewes can utilize your same size feeder because they're not as wide if you remove their wool. And similarly, you can have more animals in a set size barn, and with more animals, that results in more heat production. Then therefore you have a warming housing or a warming lambing environment. If you shear your ewes, and you can then have more in there. And then probably most important for the lambs is that they have easier access to the teats. The last thing you want them to do is latch on to wool. You want them to pretty easily, pretty quickly get up and find those teats. So when we finally get around to lambing, so as we said before, have an average of 152 day gestation. Goats is going to be a little bit different. Different breeds may be more or less. We're just going to use 152 days as an average. So in our situation, our scenario here, that would be the middle of March. Our first time ewe lambs may be 3 weeks later. So the ewes will lamb out in a larger pen or out on pasture. Again, that would really largely depend on what our system is. Lambing out on pasture is becoming very popular, both for a variety of factors. You need less infrastructure. Your labor needs are completely different. You may have different problems with health, or you may have more problems if you're lambing indoors, but then they're maybe more protected from predators. So again, we could change our situation here for so many different things, and I'm sure all of you here have way different scenarios. But in our scenario, we're going to say that they'll be lambed out in large pens. Sheep are kind of been bred and evolved to lamb without assistance, any assistance. So we strive for that. And of course, twins and triplets are desired. Sheep only will, produce as much milk as the lambs challenge them to do. So say even if your ewe genetically has the capability to produce X amount, if she only has one lamb and that lamb doesn't challenge her to produce that amount, she's not going to. So it's a lot more productive for you as a producer if your ewes are giving you 2 or 3 versus just 1. But then again, for utilizing that ewe's ability to produce milk and raise lambs. So once those lambs are born in the larger pen, we would put them into a 5x5 pen called a jug. Shorten the navel cords, dip them in a disinfectant. Oftentimes that's betadine. And this time in the jug pen, it really gives them, the lambs and the ewes, kind of a opportunity to bond, to learn each other's scent. Sheep also, they do recognize each other based off of, their visual, shape. If they have a certain color head or markings, they actually, they can recognize each other visually as well as scent and sound. So those lambs are weighed and ear tags. And then if you're going to take any records, you would do that in this stage. So your date of birth, your sex, your weight, your tag number, all of those things. With your tail docking and castration. Again, if you're raising hair sheep, you're not going to do your tail docking. And depending on your operation, you may or may not do your castration, or you may do your different form where you castrate them high to or short scrotum castration. So again, this may vary by operation, but in this one, we're going to say do our tail docking and castration. So in the lambs and the ewes, they'll stay here at the jug inn for 1 to 3 days. Again, just long enough for them to kind of get acquainted and really memorize who each other are. So we do that because the next stage is to turn, just say an average of 4 ewes and their lambs out into a little bit of a larger pen. They not necessarily learn to recognize their mother, but they're reminded pretty quickly, say when they go over to the wrong mother and maybe she butts them away. So they learn to stay pretty close. They stay in these larger pens for maybe 1 to 2 weeks. Maybe depending, maybe you have a lot lambing all at once and you need to rotate them out faster. But again, just 1 to 2 weeks where they can kind of get acclimated, learn to socialize. Any ewes with triplets would probably be penned separately because they need a higher plan of supplementation, a higher plan of nutrition. From this stage, we may also offer creep feeding, either in the commingling phase or once they're turned out. So here's just a picture of just a really basic creep feeding system. You could buy something way fancier, or it could just be some boards put together like this. Just slots that allow the lambs to come into a designated area, but doesn't allow the ewes to come in. So just an example of a creep feeding diet, maybe some soybean meal, some cracked corn. Oops, wrong button. Allow them access to fresh water, high quality hay, and some mineral. So creep feeding, it helps to jumpstart the rumen. Just get different feeds into there, kind of teach those lambs to experiment and eat other things, and kind of just again get them acclimated to transition from a liquid diet to more of a solid, the hay as well as the grain. And again, that it really helps to develop their rumen, the epithelial wall, as well as all of their stomachs. Going from just bypassing your other compartments and going through to the abomasum to utilizing those other compartments of the rumen. So fairly self-explanatory. After we do our lambing, and again, this may depend on our time of year, and the time of our spring turnout may depend on if you're down in the south end of the state like I am, it may be towards April 1st, maybe a little bit later if you're all up at the top end of the state, if you have more snow or if it's colder. Whatever it may be, but at some point, hopefully, if you're lambing in confinement, those lambs will be turned out to spring pasture along with their ewes. And again, when they're turned into big groups like this, there's a lot of socializing, playing, running around, all of that. Arguably, one of the best times to be a sheep producer is during spring turnout when everybody's running around and excited. So at 6 to 8 weeks of age, do some lamb vaccination and pre-weaning health. So they get the same vaccination protocol as the ewes, which would be Clostridium perfringens type C and D or overeating disease vaccine, as well as tetanus shots, and give them a booster 4 weeks later. And then if needy, it depends on your operation, but if they need it, give them a coccidia treatment as well as a tapeworm treatment. I believe most lambs are affected by tapeworms when they're still on the ewe. So it's very important to evaluate if you need that treatment and give it before putting them through any stress of weaning. So once those lambs reach 90 days old, we would wean them. At this point, you could take weights and move your ewes off to a separate pen, transition them to a specified diet for drying them off. And then by 3 to 4 months of age, separate your ewe lambs from your ram lambs. That way you don't have to worry about any ram lambs breeding any ewes that reach puberty at an early age. So weaning, again, is just the process of removing the mothers from their young and them transitioning to a not milk-based diet, as you can see here, eating hay or pasture or whatever it may be. So after that, the stocker lambs would kind of be an optional phase. This slide should really be stocker lambs or marketing. In our situation where we are lambing in the middle of March, we could have everything sold by the beginning of August. If you were to lamb earlier in the year, you may be hitting that the Easter holiday, all of our ethnic holidays around that. If you lamb in the fall, you may be doing so. That way you can hit, our Ramadan, all of our holidays in December, at different ethnic holidays. But the phase after weaning, if you wanted to retain your lambs and either add some weight or just hold them until a time of the year when the markets are higher, would be the stocker. segment stocker lambs. But over the last couple years or decade or so, you know, our ethnic markets have kind of decreased the relevance or the need for this segment of the industry, because, you know, depending, some cultures, you know, they'll harvest the lamb, either a 50-pound lamb, you know, for whichever holiday, or they may, you know, they may not need that lamb grown and finished all the way up to 150 pounds. So this segment of, or this, you know, holding a lamb and adding weight to them is not nearly as relevant as it used to be. You know, we really can just send the lambs when they're weaned, can send them to market for somebody else to do something else with. So this is kind of just a conditional phase of the life cycle. So on the use side, after we wean those lambs, they go back to, you know, if we're not in a drought and we have that the forage to do so, the ewes go out to graze grass, put that condition back on. You know, again, if we're not in a drought, ideally we only give mineral supplementation. Any ewes who had poor reproductive performance, we would go ahead and call them. You know, if we're sending a load of lambs to the sale barn, you know, the ewes may go on there and be sold in a separate group. But again, we would probably call them at this phase of the year or the cycle. Replacement ewes, any of the ewe lambs that we're going to keep, would breed them at about 7 months, or when they're 2/3 of mature size. So depending on your ewe size or your mature ewe size, maybe about 100 pounds. And ideally, it can be beneficial to raise them in a separate group, just for differences in their need of management as well as nutrition. And then really we're kind of back full circle to the middle of October. You know, after a few months of recovery, we're kind of back full circle. And it's just kind of an ongoing process of breeding, gestation, you know, lambing, and then weaning. So our final phase, this wouldn't be for our ewe operation, but for the lambs, any of them, if the lambs are going for to be a finished product, they could either be contracted to go to, say, you know, they may be finished locally with extra grain, and may be sold out of a sale barn and go maybe to Iowa, Colorado, somewhere that maybe a drier environment that they have these. But again, this is kind of the final option. Final phase that lambs possibly can go into would be a feedlot to put on that grain finish. They could also be grass finished, but again, that's just kind of the final phase of taking our lambs and turning them into a finished product. So with that, kind of a shorter presentation than the last few weeks, but I was told there may be lots of questions. So yeah, happy to entertain any questions, dive into variations of this very basic breakdown of what an operation could look like.
All right, Charlie, there is one question that we didn't address in the chat box. Just probably needs a little bit of clarification. Do you give lambs CD&T, and if so, when? Yes,
the lambs should get CD&T. I had it on here. 6 to 8 weeks of age. Really, I think it's probably more important to just make sure it's done before weaning. Again, so you want to make sure that they have that immunity before they're put through that stressful period of, you know, their mothers being taken away, having to transition onto especially a grain diet. That's really the transition. If they're being transitioned onto a grain diet, that can really be the cause for when we see overeating disease. So yeah, 6 to 8 weeks of age, or I'd say more importantly, just before they're weaned.
And there may be a little bit of variation in that we want mom to be sufficiently vaccinated prior to lambing. That does make a difference in when you decide to vaccinate them. If the mother wasn't vaccinated, then you're probably going to want to do it a little bit earlier if you have bottle babies that didn't get sufficient colostrum. All right, so another vaccine related question: how do goat I just lost it. Hang on. Probably I'll come in at the same time. How do goat vaccinations differ from sheep vaccinations? There's not generally we give both CD&T to both sheep and goats. There are some vaccines that are labeled specifically for goats and not for sheep. You just want to make sure that whatever you're giving is labeled, because this is one of the few things that we have labeled for both goats and sheep. So just make sure that if you're running both animals, if you're running both sheep and goats, make sure you get one that is labeled for both of them. If you just have goats, you may have another option, but it's still going to be a CD&T vaccine. And I believe the one he has pictured there, I believe that one does everything: cattle, sheep, and goats. All right, and there was one before that about culling. Is weighing at 60 days for lamb sufficient for culling decisions?
I guess I would answer that with depends on how strict of culling parameters you have, as well as I think there's other things to consider with if you're going to remove a female, other than her lamb weight. This, a larger ewe may produce, more weaned pounds, but if she's also eating more, are you really money ahead? I think there's other things to consider than just ewe weight. Now, if you have across the board, all of your ewes are, perfectly uniform, then yes, you could wean based off of that. I think that it kind of depends or varies by operation, in my opinion.
Yeah, the classic, it depends.
Right, yep.
It's all in what your goals are, what else has happened on the farm. There's a lot of questions that we answer with, it depends. Sometimes you need more information. So a lot of times you need more than one season too to make some of those decisions.
Right.
All right, someone wrote, let me scroll down. We have some 4-Hers watching. What do you think would be good items to have on hand in their lambing kits?
Susan, I know on your website you have, here, I'm actually going to switch. I just had that open. If you all go to Sheep 102, Susan has a really nice checklist of things she recommends having in a lambing kit. I could say, lube, gloves, betadine, sanitation's important. If you wanted to really get deeper into it, you can have a prolapse retainer. I can list off a few things, but I'm probably going to forget more than I do. So I would say if you go to Sheep 102, and there's a tab on lambing, Susan has a really good list of things you want to have in your lambing kit.
Yeah, start with something to disinfect the navel with. So there's different products for that, like betadine can be used, iodine, they make a navel spray. That should definitely, anytime you're having lambs or kids, definitely have that. And I always recommend a thermometer. No matter what you're doing, have a thermometer on hand. The rest of it's going to vary. And it varies on how many animals you have too, how much you end up using of that. You can go for years without needing a lamb puller. You might need it once every 10 years, depending on how big your operation is. But with 4-Hers, for sure, something for the navel, and gloves are always good too. Let's see. What dosage of lamb vaccine is the booster the same?
I believe it is. I believe it's 2 cc's for everything.
Yeah, it doesn't matter what the age is or the size for vaccines.
Right.
Farmers absolutely matters, but vaccines, it's just uniform across the board per species. Cattle, I don't know how much are cattle. Sheep and goats tend to be the same.
I think cattle are also 2 cc's. Yeah.
Okay. All right, let me go down to the next one. And your booster generally be the same. The main thing with that depends on the age, or depends on whether or not it's had a vaccine before. That's the big kicker with when it comes to vaccines, whether it's a first series or whether it's just a booster.
Actually, looking at the bottle right here, I guess cattle would be different because it's 50 mils and that's 10 cattle doses or 25 sheep and goats. So
Yeah,
cattle are different, but sheep and goats, the booster and the initial, I believe are going to be 2 mils.
yeah, I think so. I've done a lot of them. I'm pretty sure they're 2. What diet considerations do you need to keep in mind when keeping sheep and goats together?
I think our go-to answer on that is the copper sensitivity of sheep.
Yeah, and the goats tend to need more, so you're going to have to keep that in mind. But that's the big one, is going to be copper. Everything else, can be managed around, but the copper is the hard part.
I think another thing in that situation is the size difference, making sure all of your animals can come up to eat. A 150-pound ewe is probably going to push, especially a young doe, out of the way. So make sure everybody can eat at the same time.
Your big does too might bully if you have a small breed of sheep. So it's more personality issues when you get past the copper. And then you have horns, and on the goats tend to have horns. Sheep, a lot of the sheep breeds are polled, so that can create some drama at the feed bunk. But the big issue is copper, for having them both together. That can be difficult to manage. Do you have anything differently with any bottle/pet lambs that can't be on? Do you do anything differently with any bottle pet lambs that can't be on the ewe for any reason? I'm not really sure what you mean with that. I'm guessing maybe, as long as you're raising them, you may, depending on how much colostrum they got, you may consider starting their vaccines a little earlier, especially if they're going to get exposed to anything. But usually that's the only, and you may have to clarify that if you mean something else. Just put another comment in there. Next one. All right, so this might be something Susan may have to chime in on. So I've not done any work with this. I'm wondering if we have any thoughts on the new mastitis vaccination. As with any vaccine, you need, the only reason you consider it is if you're having a problem with it. Personally, I've not had any problems with mastitis in my flock, either sheep flock or the goat herd myself. I did test all of my ewes for OPP, and if I was seeing a lot of mastitis issues, that'd probably be something that I would look at for both the sheep and the goats. But I've not had any problems with mastitis, any active cases in any of the sheep. I've had a couple of milkers that started mastitis, and I treated that just with essential oils, and it cleared up and milked them out. I don't know, Charlie, have you done anything with mastitis vaccines?
I've never used the mastitis. I've looked into hoof rot vaccines, which are not labeled for sheep and goats, but just kind of done the research. And I mean, essentially, the mechanism is you're vaccinating for a type of bacteria, similar to your CD&T, your Clostridiums. You're vaccinating against a type of bacteria. So, the effectiveness, if they're labeled, through the FDA, then they have to work. It's kind of like, when you get a question of, does the off-brand Draxxin work as well? Well, if it's labeled and it's been approved, then it has to. Again, whether that works for your operation, that's a different question.
Something like that, I'd start asking the question, why you're seeing it? Is there, are you weaning too soon? At the height of that milk production curve, And that's causing it, because I have seen that, especially in sheep, where babies get weaned off too fast. But you also look at, the cost of the vaccine, the time that it takes to administer it, stuff like that. So, I mean, that would vary from operation to operation.
Susan said in the chat, mastitis vaccine is effective against staph infections. Haven't gotten any veterinarian opinions on it. With the comment on I'd talk to your veterinarian about it. They're going to be familiar with, not just for mastitis, but anything that's in your area. If there's a lot of, one thing going around this year, they're going to be the ones who are treating if you don't want to talk to your neighbors, well, your vet probably is.
Yeah.
The effectiveness of a vaccine, or, needing to do one practice this year. It seemed like last year flies were terrible for some species, and your vet's gonna know what's going on in the region.
All right, another question: how do you manage parasite load on lambs put out the pasture with their moms?
So there's a whole host of things with that. I think rotational grazing is a really important tool. Getting those sheep moved around, or goats, getting them to clean, fresh pasture before, to help break the life cycle. So, grazing a new pasture before the eggs hatch, and they can, take those parasites up, and then not coming back until, the life cycle of the parasite. They would have past that stage of needing to be picked up to continue the life cycle.
There's we do have the integrated parasite management. I do recommend that for anybody and everybody that has sheep or goats. And that is all online. Thanks to COVID, that is all online. So those are really great management practices you can implement to prevent some of the parasite infections. Not going to treat them, but some of those will prevent them. Especially when you're dealing with young animals. All right, here's another rotating question, but not with pastures. How often do you rotate bucks or rams? I'm guessing with rotating them as in getting a new one, replacing it in the flock. Is the way I look at that one.
I think that's another, it depends. If you are trying to incorporate new genetics a lot faster, you could, trade out your bucks a lot faster. If you're trying to, spread your cost of buying a buck or a ram, spread it over as many as females, you might keep them for 5 years versus 3. I think there's a lot of things that play there, maybe he's just not cut out for your environment, and you have to give him a lot of supplementation to recover him after the breeding period, or maybe you don't like his kids. I think it's, again, this comes down to your operation.
Okay. There was a question about coccidia, and we are going to cover the coccidia in the next webinar. There's a lot to that. So our next webinar is going to be keeping them healthy, I believe. So that will be included in that presentation. And I am trying to go in order, get them as they come in. All right. Is it the case that the market in the Eastern US prefers intact males, and of what age? Why is this? So
I don't know the answer to that.
It's it has a lot of that has to do with the ethnic holidays, especially when you get into the Middle Eastern countries, people from the Middle Eastern countries. A lot of that goes back to Old Testament, where they sacrificed lambs that were unblemished. So they wouldn't have had a tail docking would be a blemish, castration would be a blemish. So a lot of that goes back to that, and the ages can vary depending on the holiday. So there is some variation. There's some holidays where they want something young, some where they prefer something older. So that's one of the reasons. Also, in certain countries, it's kind of what you grow up with. So in certain countries, especially when you get into goats, People who grew up in a country where they ate intact bucks prefer that taste. So it can be as simple as that. So it depends on who you're marketing to. If you're marketing in the US to just regular US, anybody, most of us, like if it was me eating it, I would prefer a wether or a female. But I do know people who grew up in other countries who prefer intact males. And then there's the holiday consideration for others. I personally don't like the bucky taste myself, but there are people who do. What are good indicators / warning signs of insufficient nutrition in pasture-fed sheep or goats?
I'd say your most immediate indicator would be their, the amount of condition they have. If they're dropping body condition, if you put your hands on them and you can feel the vertebrae, feel the ribs, they're probably utilizing their body reserves instead of being fed enough. Kind of secondary, something that's going to show up way later, would be your conception and your reproductive efficiency. But hopefully you can correct it before you have a poor lamb or kid crop.
Next question is, do you recommend a cull use once they prolapse?
I would say so. I've always been told once something prolapses once, they're keen to or disposed to do it again, just with the weakening of all the the supporting tissues, depending on whatever kind of prolapse it may be, but it's probably a good idea to go ahead and do that.
Yeah, it depends on how attached you are. She maybe get culled from your breeding flock and not necessarily your farm, depending on who it is. But yeah, that's definitely something that I'd be very leery of breeding again, depending on, unless you can make a good excuse, like it was a small rectal prolapse. Some of them don't require any intervention and then go back to normal. Like, if they got too fat or they're carrying a lot of lambs or kids, sometimes they'll have a slight rectal prolapse and it'll self-correct once they stand up. But if it was a prolapse that required intervention, then I wouldn't chance it again myself. What is the recommended diet for the ram prior to him breeding the girls?
I'd say the most important thing with that is don't get them over conditioned. So don't have them on just a straight grain. They're really putting on a lot of condition because then they're going to be out of shape. So I'm a cattle person, and we always like to say when you get a bull in, have the feeder on one side of the pen, have the water on the other side. That way they're doing some walking. You don't want them to be in just a small pen where they get to sit around and eat all day and then kick them straight out to having to run around to 20 girls in one day. If you think about that, that's they're going to be pretty out of shape. So kind of try to keep them in shape. Give them a similar diet to what they're going to be turned out on. So if they're going to be turned out on onto grass, at least have them on hay. That way their rumen is it already has the bugs for fiber digestion. They're not going to have to transition from grain digesting bacteria to fiber digesting. They can just go right out and just start breeding. They don't have to adjust themselves.
All right. And Susan put a comment in here that if you're giving Covaxin 8, which is another type of vaccine that covers clostridial diseases, there's a difference in the amount you give for the initial versus the booster. It's 5 mils on the initial and boosters 2 mLs. I was teaching pesticide recertification. Always read the label with pesticides. Always read the label with your medications that you are giving with your animals, because there could be differences depending on what brand that you get. So always read your labels for that. All right, this is back to that bottle. Is there that bottle lamb question? Is there any anything in their schedule that would differ, such as vaccine time, when they go on a creep or in with other lambs. Let me make sure I got all of that. All right, so with bottle babies, like I said, you may have to give their vaccinations if they didn't get colostrum, or you don't think they got sufficient colostrum. You may want to start the vaccines a little earlier, and then the rest of that's gonna, if you can have them with another lamb, you're gonna have more success with getting them onto creep feed. Sometimes bottle babies, because they don't have anybody to set an example for them, so if it ends up being a single bottle baby, sometimes it's hard to get them on the creep feed. And then you're gonna have to watch them when you put them in with other lambs, because they're gonna be at the bottom of everything. They may get picked on. So you always need a friend for your animals. So even when you have bottle babies, it's always best if you have another lamb that they're raised with. They'll adjust to regular farm life a lot easier. But you're gonna have to be careful with them, especially if you raised it as just a single lamb. It's going to take a lot longer to get it on the feed a lot of times, and you may have some issues. Lambs not quite as bad as goats, but there may be some issues when you do put it in there with the other ones. And you'll have to take the environment into consideration, and the weather, depending on how they're raised. If it's been in a closed-in barn and you put it in more of an open barn and the weather's still pretty bad, it might not adjust as well. So there's just a lot of variation. You just have to keep a very close eye on it. All right. Oh, here we get this one. I think every webinar we get this question: how many head per acre?
Yes, that really goes into your forage management. So you could put 100 head on an acre. If they're only going to be there for a day. If you want to be continuously stocked, not do any rotation. I was always, when I was always told as a kid, for my area, 10 goats, 1 cow to the acre, 10 goats to the acre. If a cow's 1,000 pounds and a goat's 100 pounds, that's equivalent. But you really have to think, well, if it's a drought year, you have less forage, so you need to destock or not have as many. If you're rotationally grazing, like I said, you can have 100 goats on 1 acre if you have 30 other paddocks that you can rotate them through, and you give that 1 acre time to rest. So there's a lot. I can't give just I don't know your area. I don't know what kind of forage you're on. If you're on a type of forage, you only get 4,000 pounds of dry matter versus, maybe a summer annual where you get 10,000 pounds of dry matter. There's a lot of considerations when they say how many head per acre. How long are they going to be there? How much forage do you have? That's four other webinars tied up into one question, but we're happy to if you want to reach out, happy to look at your operation and try to come up with some more specific recommendations for your grazing management.
All right, looks like Susan answered a couple of these. So I'm going to skip ahead. Is there much benefit to breeding twice a year, different use / dose, say 1 breeding in spring and 1 breeding in fall? Would this be worth it to have fresh milk all year round? How else would you suggest always having fresh milk? It sounds kind of like more of a goat question. I think. You have any thoughts? If not, I'll give my thoughts.
So probably just an hour ago, I was trying to brush up and on Susan's sheep 102. She goes over, some of the different, breeding types of the year, but then the different systems of, maybe you have 3 lambings within 2 years or 5 lambings within 3 years. You could, if you leave your ram out year long, well, if your ewes or your does are off, well, then you could possibly, you could have 1 every month. If you want that steady supply, then you could plan for that. I think a lot of that goes into, your labor, your forage. Do you want to be managing them? Do you want to always have one a month that you have to watch that she's going to lamb, or do you just want to get it all done within a 30-day period and be done? But I would definitely check out Susan's 102, Sheep 102, and it talks about different systems on how to, kind of intensify it more than just getting one lamb crop per year.
Yeah, and if they may be looking for fresh goat's milk for like the family consumption all year round, and that is probably the best way to get it would be to have staggered breedings, because you can get some of these extended lactations on certain lines of dairy goats, but you're going to get more bang for your buck when you have those shorter lactations. So you may be feeding quite a bit to your does to get them to produce the amount of milk that you need, but is it going to be financially worth it? Maybe, maybe not, depending on how much you're actually getting, versus, working with those more natural lactation cycles. And then, like Charlie said, I mean, it's going to be more labor intensive, having basically kids or lambs, depending on what you're breeding, year round, and having to constantly watch them, and they have to be managed separately too. All right, when not breeding, what is the best practices for keeping rams? I have heard to keep them out of eyesight of the ewes.
So I don't claim to be an expert, on the ram effect, but with the concept of, when you first show them that ram and, just doing that on and off and leading to the higher conception rates, more ovulation, it may be worth doing that. I don't know if they have a fence in between them, how much of a difference. I might let Megan comment on that.
Yeah, it's going to depend on it. It's another one of these it depends questions. You're going to have probably better success when you start breeding if they've been kept as far apart as possible. But a lot of us are working with smaller acreages where that's probably not going to be possible. But if you can't keep them very far apart, then good fences are going to be a must. Because he's always probably going to want to get out there. You may have to have, if you've only got the one ram, you might need to have a buddy for him, whether it's a wether or, usually a ewe is going to be pretty fertile her whole life. So that's not always the best option. But it depends. Definitely need that good fence to keep them apart, if that's your goal, because rams and bucks can be very destructive if they want to get out of a fence. Right. Oh, here it is. All right. Is it okay to feed very small amounts of grains to wethers? It's hard to separate my ewes with lambs from wethers. So I'm guessing these are older pet wethers, possibly. And there's probably a concern for urinary calculi.
I have a set of twin lambs and 2 wethers that are 2 years old or under.
Okay.
So the concern with urinary calculi is a calcium phosphorus imbalance. So I would just make sure that whether you have to mix a little bit of limestone to get that balanced, get it balanced right. Maybe talk to your feed mill or ask one of us. Somebody who has just a basic diet calculator. Our grains are high in phosphorus and low in calcium, and it's that phosphorus that leads to the kidney stones. So I think having them together, you're probably fine. If you want a little, you could either include it like a buffer, like bicarbonate, that would help with that. Or again, you could just make sure your calcium phosphorus balance is right. But I doubt you're gonna end up having an issue in that situation.
It's it is definitely a problem with sheep. It's more of a, seems to be more of a problem with goats, and it all comes down to that calcium, the phosphorus. And you also want to make sure that there's plenty, that they're getting plenty of forages to eat, so that if there is any excess phosphorus, that it goes out with the manure versus with the urine, and plenty of water, so that they are keeping everything flushed through. The age at which they're weathered may or may not play a role in how fast they could get blocked, but it ultimately, the grit and the stones come from that imbalance in their ration. All right, another question: when can I breed does after kidding? How long should I wait?
Megan, I don't know what the involution period is.
It's another one of those it depends questions. Usually I mean, they're tied to the seasons, so it's not going to, you know, how quickly you want to rebreed may or may not be up to you, depending on what season it is and how seasonal your does are. And then it comes down to recovery after they've had kids. Even if they do come in season, you know, are they physically able to get rebred? Because they do need to recover. And in my experience, you know, I have goats versus hair sheep, and goats take a lot longer to recover than hair sheep do. So, you know, it's gonna depend on how many kids they were nursing. You know, they do need to recover back. It's to your advantage to get them back into condition. If you're letting them get too thin, their product, you might be breeding them twice a year, but you're probably going to get a single each time. If you're breeding them too close and they're not able to recover. But again, it's another one of those classic, it's going to depend. But a lot of times it's best just to let it work naturally, because by the time they, you know, if they have their kids at the right time in a seasonal time, they do have that summer to recover before they're bred again. And you may be able to get their condition back up, and you may get multiples out of it. But if they're thin, you're likely going to get singles. All right. And there are some. All right, what's this one? How long do you usually recommend leaving rams in with ewes to breed?
That would depend how long of a lambing or kidding window you want. So as I mentioned, you know, if you wanted to give them, with sheep, if you wanted to give them 3 extra cycles, opportunities to get bred, you know, that'd be 51 days. If you wanted to call on reproductive efficiency, you know, you could cut that down maybe to 34 days. You know, if you only have 5 months from now, if you only have a month, and then you really get busy with farming, you maybe you want a tighter lambing window. So it kind of depends on your operation. Do you want to give everybody a chance to get bred, or are you really want to you know, push those females to be more productive and, you know, single out the ones that aren't?
All right, the next question is, how often should you rotate pastures? Can you immediately rotate onto a donkey pasture? I've heard that there are different parasites, so you don't need to rest the pasture.
So your frequency of rotation kind of it depends on how you know, how tightly did you graze the forage before, you know, or are we going into winter where you're not going to get a lot of regrowth? So you know the term overgrazing, it's not how tightly you graze it down to the ground, it's whether or not you give it an opportunity to recover. So, you know, if I just graze the top 2 inches off of a forage and it's 12 inches, you know, I can probably come back pretty quick because there's a lot of forage that's left. But if you graze it pretty hard, you know, you have to give it more time to rest. Rest is probably our biggest tool when it comes to managing pastures. You know, more than our soil samples, more than, you know, any kind of measuring or, you know, fencing, anything. You just rest. Rest is the biggest thing that we can do to recover our pastures.
All right. Susan commented, I think this is back to keeping the rams separated, put them in ram buck prison. There's another ram question. If you choose rent a ram, how do you locate / choose a good farm to drop the girls off for a good time? And that's if you don't want rams on site.
I would say that's word of mouth. I'd probably, ask, I don't know if there's forums or, if we have Facebook groups. But pick somebody who is raising, selecting genetics that you want a part of, somebody who's gonna, have clear communication. You're not gonna have, get mad if, they hit a drought and, you need to come, remove stuff. I think reputation can get you pretty far. And, find somebody who is, again, who's both selecting genetics that you want, as well as who manages their sheep, how you would want.
Yeah, your choices may be limited because generally this is done more with goats, and it's more of a leasing the male. So you would have to take care of the male on your site. And then there are some more, again, it's more common in goats. There are some that offer what they call driveway breedings, where you would just bring the animals while they're in heat. They bring the buck out to you, and then literally like breed them in the driveway. They may, if there is somebody offering that, they would probably want some biosecurity screenings. And that's something that you would want to as well, because there are potential to introduce diseases or pick up diseases if you are to take them somewhere. So, take that into consideration as well. Make sure that, they're following good biosecurity methods and that you are as well for their benefit. Will rams, if kept on a separate farm with only rams, still fight?
I'll let you answer that one.
It's another one that depends on the animals.
Yeah.
I worked at our local ag college while I was in college, and they pulled all the bucks and rams and put them on pasture together. There was usually some fighting when they first got onto the pasture, and they usually settled down. They were kept pretty far away from any females. But then there was that one ram that tried to kill me a few months before that, who was like an hour after they turned him out in the pasture with them, just turned up dead. So, it depends on the animals. Some may be more aggressive than others. You might be able to keep some together and they do fine. I know with bucks, I had 2 bucks that did extremely well together. They were literally a day apart in age, 2 different breeds, but they grew up together as bottle babies, and they did well when I put them back together. But it depends on the animals. You probably see some difference in the breeds as well, with some being more aggressive than others. You're going to take some, by putting them on a separate farm, you're going to take some variables out of it. But boys will be boys. So, it all depends. And I personally wouldn't want to get in the middle of a ram fight. I've already been in a ram fight. I don't want to get in the middle of 2 of them. So that just depends. You may have better luck with younger ones than older ones, especially if the older ones have never been in with other bucks or other rams. I have one right now. He's pretty laid back, and that's why he's staying. I wouldn't expect a lot. He's young too, so I wouldn't expect a lot of aggression out of him. But I have seen some that probably fight anything that crosses their paths. As Susan said, more likely to move males around than females. And then if you don't want to keep a male on site, use one for breeding, then market or eat him and get a new one every year. That's what I tell a lot of people. It's because we don't have a lot of options around here. It's still going to require you to have a ram on the farm, but generally about a month, as long as you get it during breeding season. He should cover everybody within that month, and then you could sell him or eat him if you wanted to. There's a couple of clarifications about urinary calculi. The urinary calculi causes a problem. It builds up in the urethra, where male sheep and goats have a a curved urethra. And so it's hard to, you know, if they get blocked, it's hard to unblock them because of those curves. It's hard to catheterize them. But that grit, if it's a gritty buildup, it builds up and kind of gunks everything up. And then there is the possibility of large stones that can block it as well. The large stones are a little easier to deal with because if you can get that out, you've cured the problem, versus the grit where they would need, that would need to be flushed out. And usually the vet would want x-rays to determine how bad the blockage is if you did have one with urinary calculi. And then does a good sheep mineral fed free feed help avoid urinary calculi for wethers, or still need to feed less grain feeds? You, with the boys, with wethers especially, you want to, everything needs to be properly balanced, including your minerals. The minerals they're generally going to take as they need it. And the only way that's going to avoid anything is if, you know, you maybe you're trying to balance out their ration. And the only way to guarantee that they're eating the mineral is to put it in the feed. If it's free choice, they may or may not eat it. So there's no guarantees with that. So you always want to limit the grain fed to them. Another factor seems to be overweight. So you don't want them to get too fat. And ammonium chloride can, the salt in that can dissolve stones. And some feeds, it's already included, especially if you get into goat feeds. A lot of times it's already in the feed, but it's not, as with everything, it's not 100%. So management is the best thing. Make sure that all of your feeds are properly balanced. Make sure that forage, as with any ruminant, is the primary part of the diet, and they're getting plenty of that and plenty of water. All right, someone commented that many people will put rams that are getting back into their pens after breeding into a very small pen, so they get reintroduced to each other. The small pen is to keep them from having space to run and butt heads with speed. So you're gonna fight, but it's like, you know, getting very close to the back end of a horse. If it's gonna kick you, it's not gonna hurt as bad. And then also some people put something on their butts and noses so they all smell the same, Vicks. And they use ram shields. Yes, a lot of places that sell sheep supplies do sell ram shields. So they don't have that forward vision. They only have the peripheral vision. So it is harder for them to butt stuff. I did try that on a ram before. It worked a little bit. And yes, rams can kill each other. I've seen that. Let me see, let me scroll down, see what we got. Yeah, and Susan said, free choice doesn't guarantee adequate consumption. So that is the one thing, you know, if you are feeding minerals, keep them fresh, especially with goats. They, you know, tend to do better when they have fresh minerals. All right, somebody commented, I noticed some of my ewes I saw breeding 35 days ago are standing for the ram to be bred again. Will ewes allow this after they are already bred? I would say not. If you're seeing multiple ones, I could see maybe one. But if you're seeing multiple ones, I would be very suspicious, especially if you're using a new ram that you've not used before. It's not necessarily proven. You can get, if I saw that, I would do, especially if it's over those 30 days. Once you know that everybody's past the 30 days when this should have been bred, then I would say you may want to consider a blood test to see if they're open or if they are pregnant. The blood tests are pretty easy. Takes a plain red top tube, and I think it's Bioprin that does them. There's multiple labs around the US. In this area, I think we ship to Pennsylvania. There's a lab in Pennsylvania that does that, and it's like, I think $4 to $6 per test. So if I saw multiple animals, especially if the ram been in there for longer than 30 days, I might wait a little bit longer and then send off some pregnancy tests myself. I haven't seen too many keep standing for the ram after they've been bred. As Susan said, a marking harness or brisket paint, I think it's called rattle powder, can help identify your breeding problems. So you would need to change that out. So go through one cycle with one color, and then change the color so you see how many different colors end up on the ewes. And if it's multiple ewes that happening to them, I would probably tend to blame the ram. If it was just one ewe, it could be just a problem with that ewe, but if it's multiple ewes, then it probably is your ram. All right, another question. What if you don't have a traditional pasture? Our land is primarily cedar and is being cleared a little at a time. Will purchased hay work as a forage?
Definitely. I'd almost say, especially for goats, that woody land is better than just a field of fescue. Goats prefer that browse a lot more than grass. Sheep really like broadleafs, but I think they're gonna certainly be interested in some amount of browse. So hay to get you through the winter. They'll adapt to that just as easily. There should be no problem there.
Yeah, hay's great. And you can measure more of how much your animals are eating. You'll know when you're feeding hay. You don't necessarily know how much they're eating off pasture, but you'll know when you're feeding them hay. And then the next question is, how do you know the ram is developing urinary calculi? And the problem with that is you don't always know until you have a problem. It's like a kind of a clog in your toilet. You don't know it's accumulating in there until one day you flush the toilet and it doesn't flush. And that's the thing with urinary calculi. You don't always know until there is an actual problem with it. I would say you may, if you're really watching them, you may notice that their urine stream is thinner than it used to be, but I don't know that many of us that really pay that close of attention. Generally, you're going to hear once they're blocked, you may or may not, because sheep are, especially sheep, they're prey animals. So they don't always show you that they're in pain. With goats, you're going to hear them cry when they go to urinate. And it is hard for people to identify. A lot of times what I get is somebody saying that their goat is constipated, because again, I see this more in goats than I do with sheep, but that could be that we have a lot of people keeping goats as pets now. But they'll tell me, oh, my goat's constipated. And if you tell me that a grazing animal is constipated, first thing I'm going to ask you is, how old is it and is it a male? Because generally grazing animals don't get constipated. Now a newborn baby might get constipated, but not a 6-month-old goat. So if it's a older, if it's not a newborn or not still on a bottle or nursing, then I'm gonna ask you, is it a male? And I'm gonna tell you, you need to check to see if it is blocked or not. Again, it is hard to tell because they just stand to urinate. So you might think your animal's standing there. And when you have any suspicion of it, then you need to kind of watch them. You may have to take an hour or so and watch them and see if you can see them urinate or not. If you're seeing just little dribbles, then there's likely a problem. They're not completely blocked, but again, that is still an emergency. If there's any problem in the urinary system, it's going to be an emergency. And that's a call to the vet, because even if you relieve the obstruction, usually that's a temporary fix, because you don't know how bad the obstruction is, whether, there's a bunch of grit still in there, and you've just released a little bit of urine out of it. So that's the only thing that's going to tell you that is an x-ray. And if you're not willing to go to the vet, then, putting him out of his misery would be your next best thing. They can be salvaged for meat. If it comes to that, they can be salvaged for meat as long as you've not given any medications to them.